The courtroom buzzed with quiet activity as the morning calendar began. Lawyers whispered at the plaintiff's table, clerks shuffled paperwork, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the gaps between voices. Judge Alan Whitaker, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, adjusted his robe as he settled into his bench. He glanced at the schedule. Routine hearings, minor motions, nothing unusual. The heavy door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A young black woman stepped inside. She was slim, neatly dressed in a white blouse and dark slacks, her natural curls pulled back in a professional twist. In one hand, she held a leather-bound notepad and a worn copy of the U.S. Constitution. She scanned the room and began to move toward a row of empty seats reserved for court personnel. Before she could sit, Judge Whitaker's voice boomed across the chamber. "Young lady." The entire room paused. Ava Brooks turned, surprised. "This is not an open gallery for loitering. Unless you're a witness for one of these cases, I suggest you exit the courtroom." Murmurs spread among the attendees. A few heads turned. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Did he just say that to her?" Ava's throat tightened, but she stepped forward calmly. "Your Honor, I'm Ava Brooks. I'm here for the judicial internship. I'm a third-year pre-law student at Fairmont University." Clerk Ella Chavez scheduled me to observe and assist Judge Whitaker squinted at her. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said curtly. "Court observers aren't allowed unless they're scheduled. This is a working court." Ava raised her badge slightly. "I was scheduled. I'm on the docket list. Law intern assignment." But the judge didn't look at her badge. Instead, he glanced at the bailiff, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, white, uniform crisp. "Please escort her out until we clarify," the judge ordered. Ava stood her ground, eyes locked forward. Before the bailiff could take a step, a new voice cut in from the back. Calm. Precise. "Your Honor," said Professor David Haynes, stepping into view, "there is no misunderstanding." The judge's face froze. She is exactly where she belongs. The room held its breath. Haynes continued, stepping beside Ava. "Miss Brooks is not only your assigned intern, she is also the top student in the university's pre-law honors program. She's been approved by your clerk, and I personally sent her credentials last week." The judge shifted in his seat. "I see. Well then," he cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers. "Let's move on." Ava walked to her assigned seat. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She sat, opened her notepad, and began to write. Her pen steady, her spine straight, her presence undeniable. The room had seen the moment, and no one would forget it. The rest of the session dragged on with procedural monotony, continuances, dismissed motions, plea agreements. But for Judge Alan Whitaker, his mind wasn't fully in the room. He kept stealing glances toward the young woman seated behind the clerk's desk. Ava Brooks. She hadn't said a word since taking her seat, but she hadn't looked away either. Her expression was focused, her pen gliding across the page with quiet precision. She didn't fidget. She didn't check her phone. She didn't seek his approval. That rattled him more than he cared to admit. He felt the heat of embarrassment lingering on the back of his neck. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. No indignation, no raised voice. Just the kind of calm that exposes people for who they are without ever lifting a finger. During the lunch recess, Judge Whitaker returned to his chambers, rubbing his temple. Clerk Ella Chavez was already waiting for him, arms crossed, clearly displeased. "Sir," she said, "we talked about this. Ava Brooks was assigned to you 3 weeks ago. I sent her file twice. She didn't look like the usual interns," he muttered without thinking. Ella raised an eyebrow. "And what does a usual intern look like?" He had no answer, just the sound of his own hypocrisy echoing inside his chest. "She's sharp," Ella added. "Professor Haynes says she's the most promising student he's ever taught, and that man doesn't throw around compliments. You might want to take her seriously. Before she ends up outranking you one day." Judge Whitaker gave a weak chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. That afternoon, he returned to the bench. Ava was already seated, a fresh legal pad in front of her, case law references neatly marked. He cleared his throat before addressing the court. Let's begin the afternoon session. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a quiet shift in posture, an attempt at course correction without saying the words. Ava didn't need the apology, though. She had read enough verdicts to know most people only apologize after they've been proven wrong. Instead, she did what she always did. She focused. She watched the attorneys argue a suppression motion. She noted the judge's tone, the holes in the defense's logic, the moment the prosecutor overplayed his hand. She filed it all away. And when the judge requested a case summary to be included in the daily log, she passed hers forward, clear, precise, and better than the clerk's draft. For the first time that day, Judge Whitaker looked directly at her, with something that wasn't dismissal. It was the beginning of respect. Reluctant, yes, but real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Court sessions in the morning, filings and briefings in the afternoon. The courtroom no longer bristled with tension at the sight of Ava Brooks, but that didn't mean the tension had vanished. It had simply gone underground, quieter, more coded. Every morning she arrived before the clerks, always early, always prepared. She reviewed the docket before anyone asked her to. She knew which cases had been continued, which motions were likely to be denied, and which attorneys needed to be watched for ethical slippage. She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't expect grace, but she noticed things. Like how one of the junior clerks, a recent graduate named Marcy, started double-checking Ava's work, even after it had already been approved. Or how the court officers, all white, still asked Ava to show her ID at the door, even when she was wearing her intern badge and carrying a court file. Her white classmates walked in with coffee and earbuds without so much as a nod. None of it was overt. None of it was reportable. But every moment added to a weight Ava had learned to carry long before she ever walked into a courtroom. Judge Whitaker had stopped dismissing her. That much was clear. In fact, he had begun asking for her research notes quietly, as though it was routine. He didn't look at her the same way, but he still didn't say her name aloud. He still never addressed her directly in front of the other interns. Invisible progress, the kind you can feel, but not prove. One afternoon, a high-profile case came through, a corporate fraud matter that drew a crowd of media and curious onlookers. The prosecution submitted a massive binder of exhibits. The court clerk groaned under the weight of it. But Ava had already drafted a one-page outline of the case chronology, typed, printed, and tabbed. She quietly slipped it onto the clerk's desk. By the time the judge sat down, her outline was sitting neatly next to his gavel. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't need to. He used it almost immediately. Later that day in chambers, Ella Chavez caught Ava as she was leaving. "He used your timeline." Ava shrugged lightly. "That's what I'm here for." Ella looked at her for a long second. "He respects your work. He just doesn't know how to say it yet." Ava smiled, but it was a tired smile. "I'm not here for his praise," she said. "I'm here to learn how the system works, especially the parts they don't put in the textbooks." And with that, she left. Not victorious, not bitter, just steady, strong. A quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It was a Thursday morning when the case landed on the docket, one that didn't carry media attention or high-profile names, but Ava knew it mattered the second she saw it. Case number 1-847. The People versus Madison Properties, LLC. A quiet eviction case. On paper, just another landlord-tenant dispute. But in reality, it was something heavier. A fight between a wealthy real estate developer and a single black mother named Tanya Fields, raising 2 kids in a modest apartment on the east side. The landlord claimed unpaid rent. Tanya claimed retaliation. She'd filed complaints about broken heating, mold, and unsafe stairs. 2 weeks later, she received an eviction notice. Ava reviewed the file carefully, her brow furrowed. Something wasn't adding up. She dug into prior rulings, searching through the judge's own archived opinions. And then, like uncovering a buried truth, she found it. A 2017 case, Whitaker versus Keller Estates. nearly identical in legal framework. In that ruling, Judge Whitaker had sided with the tenant, citing a landmark precedent about landlord retaliation. But today, the judge seemed to be leaning toward dismissal. From her seat behind the clerk's desk, Ava scribbled a note, clipped it to a copy of his prior ruling, and passed it, wordlessly, to the clerk. The clerk scanned it, eyes widening, then slid it across to the bench. Judge Whitaker unfolded the page, paused, and adjusted his glasses. He stared at the ruling, his own words, his own legal standard. Then he looked out at the defendant, a tired mother clutching a folder of handwritten notes, and then at the polished, overconfident lawyer representing Madison Properties. The judge sat back. Something in his posture changed. "I've reviewed relevant precedent," he said, voice even but firmer than before, "including one of my own prior decisions. Based on that, I'm issuing a stay of eviction. The court finds that there is sufficient evidence of potential retaliation. A formal hearing will be scheduled within 10 days. Gasps filled the room. Tanya's shoulders collapsed in silent relief. The attorney for Madison Properties objected, but Whitaker cut him off. "Objection noted. Ruling stands." The gavel came down. As the room emptied, Ava gathered her files, ready to leave. But before she could stand, Judge Whitaker spoke quietly. "Miss Brooks." It was the first time he had said her name aloud. She looked up, calm and composed. "You found that opinion fast." "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "It was relevant." He nodded slowly. "You may have saved me from contradicting myself today." Ava offered a small, professional smile. "I'm just applying what I've learned, sir." There was a pause. A long, unspoken understanding passed between them. Not equality, not yet, but something close. Recognition. For the first time, the judge didn't see her as the intern who didn't belong. He saw her as what she had always been, a mind worth listening to. Respect, Ava had learned, doesn't travel in straight lines. Even after the eviction case, even after the judge began saying her name and asking for her memos directly, not everyone in the courthouse was ready to change their narrative. Especially not Elliot Maynard. Elliot was a second-year law student interning from a private East Coast university. His father was a federal judge, his uncle a senior partner at one of the largest firms in the state. He wore expensive loafers and a smug confidence that couldn't be bought, because he'd never had to buy it. From the start, Elliot had dismissed Ava as a diversity placement. "You go to Fairmont?" he'd asked casually during their first week. "That's nice." After the judge began praising her work, and after she started taking the lead on research assignments, Elliot's tone shifted. Not to admiration, but resentment. "She's just a pet project," he whispered one day near the break room. "Optics. You know how it is. Can't say no to these universities anymore." A junior clerk overheard it and warned Ava later that afternoon. Ava didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. And besides, Elliot was loud for a man who knew he was falling behind. That week, Judge Whitaker issued an internal challenge. Both Ava and Elliot were to draft legal briefs, analyzing a new ruling on qualified immunity. Ava dove into the case. She read not just the ruling, but the full oral arguments, dissenting opinions, and historical context. She studied how different circuits were interpreting the standard. Elliot, meanwhile, copied half of his brief from a secondary source and padded it with unnecessary jargon. When the judge reviewed both submissions, the verdict was clear. "Miss Brooks," he said during Chambers' briefing, "your work is law review material. Clear, sharp, well-grounded." He turned to Elliot. "Yours, mister." Maynard was wordy. And missed the central issue. Elliot turned red. Ava simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. Because Ava wasn't there to win a competition. She was there to break a pattern. And that was the real threat to people like Elliot. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She already did. The final week of the internship brought an unexpected announcement. Judge Whitaker had called for a formal closing ceremony, something he hadn't done in over a decade. Most of the clerks were surprised. Some were annoyed. Ava simply kept working, unsure of what to expect. The ceremony was held in the courtroom after hours. The lights were dimmed and the benches were filled with students, professors, a few court staff, and even some of the local attorneys who had watched the interns grow over the summer. Judge Whitaker stepped up to the bench, not in robes this time, but in a gray suit that looked heavier than usual. Not physically, but emotionally. He cleared his throat. I've presided over hundreds of cases, written thousands of opinions, and worked with more interns than I can count, he began. Some brilliant, some forgettable. A polite ripple of laughter moved through the room. He paused, then turned his gaze toward Ava. But this summer I made a mistake. On the first day of session, I misjudged a young woman based not on her resume, but on her appearance. I assumed she was in the wrong room. I assumed she didn't belong. The room went silent. Elliot shifted uncomfortably in the third row. I've spent my career demanding that people respect this courtroom, that they honor the law, follow procedure, and speak only when recognized. But I failed to follow my own principles that day. He took a breath. Miss Ava Brooks didn't call me out. She didn't argue. She let her work speak for her. And over these past months, that work has been exemplary. I owe her more than an apology. I owe her credit. Ava sat motionless, unsure how to respond. Her professor beside her smiled with pride, but she could feel her hands trembling in her lap. Judge Whitaker continued, I hope, Miss Brooks, that after law school, you will consider returning here. This court needs minds like yours, sharp, courageous, and grounded in purpose. He closed the folder in front of him. You've changed the way I view this bench, and for that, I thank you. No thunderous applause, just stillness, and then a slow, steady clapping from the back row, where Professor Haynes stood with his arms crossed and eyes wet. Soon, the room followed, but Ava didn't stand, didn't bow, didn't rush to shake hands. She sat quietly as she always had, her face composed, but in her chest, something settled. Not just recognition, validation. Not because he gave it, but because he had no choice but to see what had been there all along. 2 years later, the courtroom looked different. New coats of paint, updated technology, a few new faces behind the desks. But the soul of it, the heavy silence, the echo of hard truths, the feel of justice teetering on the edge of human imperfection, remained the same. So did the man at the bench. Judge Alan Whitaker, now partially retired, sat at his familiar post during a youth justice forum, an annual event meant to encourage young people, especially those from underserved communities, to consider careers in law. He had been asked to moderate, but the keynote speaker? That was someone else entirely. She stepped through the courtroom doors in a navy blue suit, her curls free now, elegant and untamed. Ava Brooks, newly appointed public defender of the state's youth division, the youngest ever to hold the title. The crowd of high schoolers murmured as she took the podium. Some recognized her from online articles. Others had only heard the name. But when she spoke, the room stilled. I used to sit where you're sitting, she began. And once, I stood in this very courtroom, and a judge told me I didn't belong. She didn't turn toward Whitaker. She didn't need to. He didn't know I was there to intern. He didn't know I was top of my class. He just knew what I looked like, and decided that was enough. The students leaned in. Black girls in the third row straightened in their seats. A few boys in hoodies stopped tapping their shoes. But I didn't walk out that day, she continued. I stayed. I worked. And I let my presence speak louder than his assumption. Judge Whitaker looked down at his folded hands. There was no shame in his eyes, only memory. I've learned that real justice doesn't come from power, Ava said. It comes from presence, from showing up even when the door feels shut, and from holding it open for the next one in line. A pause. If no one ever tells you this, let me be the first. You belong. In this room. At that bench. In every place they say, you don't. The crowd erupted into applause. Later, as the event wrapped up and the students filed out, Ava and Judge Whitaker stood side by side near the bench. Not quite colleagues, not quite student and teacher anymore, but something new. Still writing rulings I can use against you, Ava said with a teasing smile. Whitaker chuckled. I hope you do. Keeps me sharp. They shared a quiet handshake, one that meant more than words ever could. Ava walked out of the courtroom as she had walked into it years ago. Proud, focused, undeniable. But this time, she didn't just occupy the space. She owned it.